at the Safford Pavilion at Heritage Village. The Safford Pavilion is one of our more unique structures. It's the Adirondack style, which was prevalent actually in upper New York State, where the Saffords came from. And Anson Safford and his sister, Jane Safford, were both buried a week apart, where this was originally located in Cicadia Cemetery in Tarpon Springs. We're very excited to bring a program to you featuring the life of Dr. Mary Jane Safford and performed by Dr. Elizabeth Coachman. What's really exciting about Dr. Coachman's portrayal and reenactment of Dr. Mary Jane Safford is that she does it in first person, speaking as if she were alive in 1887. And she's done so much research on this woman's life, hoping to one day write a book about her, that you learn all kinds of things, not only about Dr. Safford, but about the women's movements of the day and about life in Tarpon Springs. Dr. Coachman has performed this portrayal here several times at Heritage Village, and we're just happy to bring it to you as a centennial program and part of our Speaking of Local History.
I chose to speak about Dr. Safford as a reenactor of Dr. Safford because I had been originally asked back about 10 years ago by Mr. Hoffman, Ed Hoffman, who was a designer in Tarpon Springs, if I would do a reenactment. As a female physician myself, I could understand some of the trials and tribulations of, even in the 20th century, a female physician. And he thought I could empathize with her. I at first demurred from doing this because I thought, I'm not an actress, I don't do such things. But Mr. Hoffman was persistent, and eventually he wore me down, and I agreed to do one presentation of Dr. Safford at the Safford House. Mr. Hoffman had been instrumental in getting the Safford House placed on the National Register of Historic Places, and he thought that it would be good if there could be a reenactor for Dr. Safford. Dr. Safford and her brother Anson Safford were instrumental in the early stages of Tarpon Springs, and I thought, since I lived in Tarpon Springs, that it would be a good idea to learn more about it, and so I agreed to be Dr. Safford. The reaction that I get from the audience is generally very enthusiastic. People are learning facts and information that they had never heard about the establishment of the town of Tarpon Springs, and about women's rights groups and temperance groups and dress reform and all sorts of different things regarding both the Safford family and historical items about the United States in general, what was going on in the world between the Civil War, the gold rush out in California, the women's groups in Boston. The Safford family history is a mirror of the history of what was going on in the United States and the development of Florida, the very beginnings of Florida. And people are learning this, and they generally ask me lots of questions about it, and I find myself being asked even later more questions about it and trying to find out more myself about it. It's a fascinating topic. I would like people to understand that Dr. Safford was a 19th century woman who did not let 19th century conventions get in her way. She was not only a quiet country doctor in Tarpon Springs who just happened to live here, but was a woman who was involved on a national level in many different fields, whether we're talking about women's rights or medical training. She lived her life the way she wanted to, and she allowed others to live their lives. She was a pioneer in a number of different fields. She was a pioneer here in Tarpon Springs, and because of her presence in the world, I think a lot of other people's lives were far better.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marni. I'm the minister here in this church, but I like to time travel. And so I'm going to invite you to travel back with me to April 4th, 1887. And Dr. Mary Jane Safford has just walked over here to the Church of the Good Shepherd from her residence across the street. And she's here to talk with us about what's going on in the town of Tarpon Springs and some of tidbits from her own life and some of the people that she knows. So, Dr. Safford, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Reverend Harmony. It's my pleasure to be here today. April 4th, 1887. Can you imagine? It's already 1887. Time just flies, doesn't it? And here we are. Our town has just become incorporated only several weeks ago on February 12th. I mean, we're talking maybe 6 weeks now. We were an incorporated town. And so many things have happened here. The Church of the Good Shepherd, where we're standing right now, you're sitting and I'm standing, has just had its dedication several weeks ago. And although we've been having services here for several months, we actually didn't have dedication until March 20th. But here we are, and the question is, how did we get from just 4 years ago? This was almost a wilderness. There was almost nothing here. And now we have so many people in town. We have so much going on. And where did all of this start? Well, I'll tell you a little bit about my family. I think that would be a good place to start, because they always say, talk about what you know, and that's what I know. My family was originally from Vermont. My brother, Anson Safford, and I, and my parents, who were free thinkers, I should say. They were very staunch abolitionists and were Congregationalists to begin with, but they weren't really religious, as I would think. They were married by, my parents were married by a justice of the peace, their brother-in-law. But they moved to Illinois in 1837. Conditions in Vermont at the time when they left were not the greatest economically. And my father was older. I was the last child of the family of 5, and 4 of us went with my parents to Illinois. And we ended up taking a very circuitous route, but we made it to northern Illinois, south of Chicago, to a town called Crete. And a number of our friends moved there as well. We had a whole group of people we knew, the Rexfords. Blue Island, Illinois was not very far away. The Rexfords, the Masseys, a number of people had come from northern New York and Vermont to this part of Illinois. And my family farmed, and my father was trying to get by as a farmer. My uncle was working there. We had a lot of people. It wasn't an uncle, I'm sorry, it was my cousin, was working there. He had a small hotel. And we worked very hard, but my parents they were older and they weren't well. And in 1848, my father died. 1849, my mother died. I was just a teenager, and my brother, who was several years older than I, was born in 1828, decided that he needed to take care of my older brother. Alfred had moved to study with a cousin to study law, and the oldest of my 3 brothers was farming on his own and had a family of his own by that time. So I was kind of, I was the younger sister. Nobody knew quite what to do with me. So what do you do? Well, you ship the little sister off to Vermont. Go stay with some relatives, go to school. So I did. I was sent to Bakersfield Academy, and I studied there for several years, which is the equivalent of the upper school now, before what one would call high school now, that equivalent. And I studied and was then sent up to Montreal for a year. And I learned French and I learned German. And I came back to Illinois. And my brother Alfred and I were living in Joliet, at which time he decided he didn't like law at all. And he and I moved down to southern Illinois to a town called Shawneetown, which was right on the Ohio River. And it was not my favorite place, shall we say. It was very damp, and the mosquitoes were awful. It was just not a very nice place, but there was an incredibly huge building, the State Bank of Illinois, that a man named Joel A. Madison, who was the governor of Illinois at one time until 1856, he had built this bank. And my brother was made the cashier, and Mr. Madison's son-in-law, of course, was made the president. Now, who do you think had all the responsibility there? My brother, of course. Well, in 1858, a tremendous flood wiped out most of Shawneetown, and I had been working there as a school teacher. My brother had decided he had to keep me busy and out of trouble, and the best way to do that for a single young lady at that time was to have her be a school teacher. So I had a school, and we moved, because the bank moved, because of the flood, we moved to Cairo, Illinois. Now, Cairo is at the confluence of the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers, and it is probably one of the most dismal places you can ever imagine. Now, I don't know if any of you read Charles Dickens, but there's a book called Martin Chuzzlewit he wrote a number of years ago, and he describes Cairo, Illinois. What a desolate place, dismal, muddy. Oh, I mean, I think he uses the term terra aqueous as describing the people who live there. And we had a nice house there, and Mr. Madison had another bank, and my brother was the cashier of that bank. And we made many friends, and I, again, was a school teacher. Well, things were going along fairly well, but not that well, because in the United States at that time, there was a great undercurrent of the war was going to be coming, secession was coming, and all of a sudden we were at the forefront of the Western campaign. And all of Ulysses S. Grant's troops, the Illinois volunteers, all kinds of people were coming into town as fast as possible. 1861, in June, we had a huge contingent of young men arrive to Cairo, Illinois, and they were ready to fight. They were ready to preserve the Union. And we were ready to preserve the Union, and we were ready to be rid of slavery. We thought that this was time, that this should happen. But unfortunately, what was really taking these young men, instead of battle, although we didn't like them to die in battle, but disease was. And these young men came into town and they were dying of pneumonia, of typhoid, and cholera. All kinds of diseases came in. And I saw that there was great need for help for these young men to get well. And I did everything I could. I brought delicacies in a basket every day. I would come to the gate of the camp and give them my little basket of jellies or fruits or whatever I could. But it wasn't enough. And finally, a lady named Mary Ann Bickerdike, who was sent down from Galesburg, Illinois, a very strong woman who had gone to Oberlin College, a coeducational college, I may add, at that time, came to the town of Cairo, and she took all matters in hand, and she became my mentor there. And she taught me how to take care of people. Now, you have to realize I'm not terribly large. I couldn't move bodies around. I couldn't move people, but I could help. I could clean things, and I could just be there to help feed people and write letters and do whatever was necessary. So I did. And things went along fairly well until people were getting a little bit better, and we had some hospital, at that point, some hospital beds available to us also. But in November, the first battle, the Battle of Belmont, occurred over in Missouri. And I went down there and helped Mother Bickerdike with taking care of people. It was the first time that I ever had the opportunity to see what it was like to be a true nurse on the battlefield. And the morning after the battle, I was out there with a handkerchief tied on a stick and my little truce handkerchief saying, "Please do not shoot me." And some person was shooting over my head. I couldn't believe it. But I managed to survive and got through the battlefield back to the transport boats with some of the people that I'd found who were still alive, and managed to get them to Cairo. Well, that battle was followed by two more, the Battle of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, and all of these, Ulysses S. Grant was in charge, and he won, his troops won these battles, which was really very good. My brother Alfred was quite good friends, and they shared an office, Ulysses S. Grant and my brother, so we knew the Grants very well. And when it came time for the Battle of Shiloh in Pittsburgh Landing in Tennessee, my brother and I walked down there. His wife had just died, in January. It was extremely sad, January of 1862, and my brother was not very happy, to say the least. But he knew that we needed to help our troops however we could. And we came down to the site of the battle, and it was the most unbelievable sight. I worked for days without sleep most of the time, working on the transport boats, transporting injured men from the battlefield to the hospitals in Cairo and St. Louis, wherever we could find a place for these men. And we managed to get them there. Unfortunately, during that process, I became very ill. I hurt my back, and I was in just not very much help. And my brother just forbade me to continue doing what I was doing. Even though I wanted to continue, he said, no, you may not do that. And his friend, Governor Madison, the man for whom he had worked, and who our cousin, our cousin's wife was the sister of Governor Madison, they took me with them on a trip to Europe at that time. And I toured from 1862 to 1866, all over Europe, in all different places. It was the most remarkable trip. And my friend Flora Payne and I traveled everywhere. And the things that we saw, the places we went to the Holy Land. We went all through Spain and France and Italy. And unfortunately, I contracted, when we were in Rome, I contracted something that was called Roman fever, which is a form of malaria, which I still have sequelae to this day, but it was the most remarkable trip. And we made it back to, we were back in Rome, and I decided that I did not want to spend my time with the Madisons anymore. They were going to go spend several more months in Geneva. And I started traveling on my own, and I went to Berlin, and I went to Russia. I saw things that you would not, the Foundling Hospital in Russia was just remarkable. Well, you ask, well, what was my brother doing all this time? My brother's now, the one, Alfred, was still back in Cairo, in the bank. But my brother Anson, during this time period, he'd been at the gold fields. He didn't do terribly well there, as most people didn't. But he did go out to San Francisco, and he was running what they called at that time the steam paddy, which was a steam shovel, and he was knocking down hills and building the land that was into the bay in San Francisco. And he was doing all sorts of things as working in the government. He ended up being a representative in California legislature, and he ended up being into the work in Nevada. He went out there for the Comstock load. So he was having a good old time out in the West while I was way over in Europe. Well, the time came for me to return to the United States in 1866, and my brother decided it was time that he should see Europe since I knew how to speak Italian. He hopped on a boat. When I say hopped, I wouldn't exactly say hopped, because it was quite a journey to go first from San Francisco to Panama, overland in Panama to catch another boat to New York City. And he decided to stop in Crete, Illinois on the way as well, so it wasn't exactly a direct route. He managed to get over to Europe in Florence in July of 1866. And he stayed for, well, I guess till November, and I left earlier because I had decided, after seeing all that I had seen in Europe, I had decided that I wanted to be a physician. I wanted to help people. I had so many things that I had learned, different lifestyles that I had seen, the manner of dress of people in other parts of the world intrigued me. I learned that there were so many other ways to live than what was conventional in the United States, and I felt that I could take the best of all these worlds and benefit mankind from this. I came to New York City, and I studied at the New York Medical College and Hospital for Women. It was a homeopathic medical school, because at that time, women were not allowed in what are called allopathic medical schools. In fact, when I was in medical school, the men at the Bellevue Hospital, where we did have some rotations, were so mean to us. They would swear at us, throw things at us, spit at us. It was just beyond belief. I did not like being in school in New York City, but I was getting an education in homeopathy. During the same time period, my brother, who was over in Europe with me, had come back to the United States, and he was named by President Johnson to be the Surveyor General of the state, or the territory, of Nevada. And that was a very good job for him, because at the same time that I was being graduated from medical school, and I have to say, I can't be completely humble here. I was the valedictorian. And gave the valedictory address at the same time that Elizabeth Cady Stanton gave the commencement address. It was quite a remarkable opportunity. But at that same time, he was becoming the territorial governor of the state of, or territory rather, of Arizona. And our good friend, Ulysses S. Grant, was the president at that time. And surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, at the time that Grant became president, my brother became territorial governor. And at the time that Grant finished his presidency in 1877, my brother ceased being territorial governor. And times don't change much. At any rate, at that point, I knew I needed more training. I wanted to be a surgeon. There were things that I had seen as a homeopath that I knew that I could not treat completely with homeopathic medicine. It was far superior to allopathic medicine in that we were not killing people with the doses of medicine that the allopathic doctors were giving. But I was quite sure that I needed to learn more, and I went to Europe. I decided that the best way was to get on a boat with my friend Bella Barros, who wanted to be an ophthalmologist, and the two of us showed up in Vienna at the Allgemein Krankenhaus, which was the big hospital there, and we just said, "We're here, teach us." Actually, we came with letters of recommendation, everything you could possibly want, letters of introduction, and we came and begged to be allowed to matriculate. And they said, "Well, what is it that you want? If you want just to come and learn, you are more than welcome." And we thought that was incredibly refreshing. We said, yes, that is why we're here. We want to learn as much as we can. And I took advantage of every opportunity. And I stayed there for almost 16 months, learning as much as I could about everything that they had to offer. I saw many autopsies. My teacher in that was a Dr. Rokitansky, and I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Dr. Rokitansky, but he was an incredible teacher, and he invented some of the methods for dissection that are probably even used today. He was quite remarkable. And Dr. Braun and Dr. Spiegelberg, they were just remarkable teachers. And I left there after I had learned what I could, and I went to Breslau, which was in Germany. And there I learned from several other teachers, several other surgeons, the female surgery, which I will not go into because that would be indelicate in our mixed company. But I learned a lot there, and I was allowed to perform the first oophorectomy, ovariotomy, whatever you want to call it, removal of an ovary from a lady. That was a successful surgery, and she lived, and she was very well afterwards. And that, for some reason, made tremendous news. And I couldn't understand it exactly because I thought, well, I'm as good as any man. Why should that be special? But it was considered special, and all through the medical world, there were ripples that a woman had done successful surgery. Well, I came back to the United States in 1871, and I arrived in New York very ill because seasickness was just, I was very seasick. I arrived on October 8th of 1871. And perhaps that date is not significant to you, but it was of great significance for me because that was the date of the start of the Chicago fire. And I had intended to go to Washington, D.C. to start my practice, but I knew that I was needed in Chicago. My brother and several other of our good friends had started a women's hospital there. It hadn't been built yet, but he was on the board of that hospital, and I knew that I could be in that city and practice there. And I thought, well, I'll go there and do what I can. Even if I can't practice as a physician, I can at least cook meals. I can change bedding. I can help poor people who have no homes. I can be there. And so I went there with that intent. And I ended up staying. And my friends, the Livermores, welcomed me there, Mary and Daniel Livermore, who were very staunch Universalists and had a publishing house. And I'd been writing to their newspaper while I was overseas, giving accounts of my trips overseas. But at any rate, I came to Chicago, and the practice that I had there was going quite well. I decided that I would probably settle there. But then I fell in love. These things happen, you know. And I married in September of 1872. And immediately my husband and I, his name was Gorham Blake, moved to Boston because he had family responsibilities that required our being in Boston. And I thought, well, this is actually a good opportunity because Dr. Talbot, who I knew in Chicago, who was another homeopathic surgeon, was starting a new medical school in Boston at that same time. And I thought, well, this would be a good opportunity. He had asked me to be on his faculty, and I was one of the first 5 female physicians on the medical faculty at the Boston University School of Medicine. And I arrived there all ready to go in 1872. Well, the school wasn't ready until 1873. So I needed to find something to do with myself, and I did. I became very active in women's causes and learning about what was going on in Boston at the time. I became part of what was referred to as the Radical Club in Boston. I gave very good speeches, I must say, before the club. It was quite fun. I enjoyed these people with whom I could sometimes get along and sometimes not, but it was a good place. Perhaps you've heard of the Radical Club, I don't know, but anyway, it was good. We started the medical school and everything went along quite well. 1873 I was teaching. I shared a position with Dr. Woodbury, and at that same time there was a group of women in the United States who had gotten together from all over the country and several people from Europe to form what was called the Association for the Advancement of Women. And I was one of their first directors. I was one of their first vice presidents. And a friend of mine, Fidelia Whitcomb, was also on this. Now, Fidelia Whitcomb had come from Nunda, New York. She was a very staunch Universalist. She was very active in the church in Nunda, New York. And she was also a very strident women's rights person, as was I, as were so many of the people. The lady who was president when I was vice president was Maria Mitchell, who was a professor and the first head of Vassar College. We had a very astute group of women who wanted to get women's rights, and not just for voting, but for all spheres. The idea that there was a men's sphere and a women's sphere to us seemed so inappropriate because women are perfectly capable of doing anything that a man can do short of some of the physical labor. And if you looked at the women in Europe, many of them could do the physical labor. We had this organization, and at the same time I was very involved with dress reform. Now this is something that came to my attention when I was in Europe. So many of the autopsies that I saw of women who were working in the fields, working anywhere in Europe, if they were not constrained, their body organs at autopsy were in the normal position. However, if they were in any form constrained, if they were wearing corsets or any kind of boning, their organs would be put into totally inappropriate positions, and many times the cause of death would be because of this constraint. And what I touted, and still do, is that it's very important for a woman to be properly dressed, but in such a manner as to not have any constrictions on the body whatsoever. And so you will notice that what I am wearing there is no constraint at the waist. I do not wear a corset. I feel free to tell you that, and I expect that none of you would as well. I also, for my shoes that I wear, instead of these little heels with thin soles, I wear very thick-soled shoes with very sharp or very square toes and thick, short heels, which is perfect for walking around on city streets or walking around in the sand that we have here. It works very well. I digress. At the same time, I was very active in the local medical society, the Homeopathic Medical Society. My brother's time as the territorial governor, was ending, and he became very active with the tombstone mining. At that time, there was silver being found in Tombstone, Arizona by the Shuffling brothers. And my brother thought that this would be a good way, since he hadn't made any money as territorial governor, that he might want to make some money. And he had become friends with Governor Bigler when he was out in California. Governor Bigler's brother, William Bigler, who was a governor of Pennsylvania, introduced my brother to many people in Philadelphia. And the Scheffling brothers knew where the silver was, but they didn't have any money to extract it or build a stamp mill or any of the things that were necessary to devote to mining in a new mining district. And so my brother went to Philadelphia and he organized a group of people, and he met a man named Hamilton Diston who came out to Arizona with him. And Mr. Diston and my brother had the Tough Nut mine and several other mines, and they extracted a lot of silver, a whole lot of silver. And the people in England did quite well as well. There were people who were from other parts of the country. Capitalists from all over arrived to invest their money and make a lot of money, millions of dollars, which when you look at $1887 versus 1877, $1879, it's a little bit more now than even than it was then. So he did quite well. So we see him out there, and I'm in Boston at this time, but he got married a second time. He married first in 1869, but that didn't work out terribly well, and he married again in 1878. And in 1879, in October, his wife gave birth to a little girl in Boston. Now, this little girl, he named Mary at first. He named her after me, which I was just thrilled. I thought this was wonderful. And unfortunately, his poor wife, Margarita, was a very young lady. She was only 20. She was ill with consumption. And he took her to New York, and she died in January of 1880. And Mary, the baby who was left with me up in Boston, was at this point a half orphan. And my brother said, well, I can't take her out to Arizona and raise her by myself. And I'd like you to take her. So I did, and I've been raising her. And my brother decided that he would like to change her name from Mary to Margarita, because he loved his wife so much that he wanted her name to continue. And so he changed her name to Margarita. And so I've been raising Margarita. She lives here with me. And a few years later, I realized that she was, as an only child, it just wasn't right to have her be an only child. She needed a playmate. And so I decided that the best thing I could do was get her another little girl to be her sister. And so we brought Gladys into the family. She was born in 1883. And so little Gladys is with us now. She's 4 years old, and she's quite the Dickens. That's all I can say about her. But she's very nice. And our household here, well, I'll tell you how we got here. That's where I started, didn't I? I was telling you how we got here to begin with. Well, my brother and Mr. Diston learned from Mr. Diston's friend, the Governor Bloxham of Florida, that there was a necessity for Florida to come up with a lot of money, and quickly, because there was no commerce was going to be able to take place if Florida did not pay off interest that it owed on bonds that were left from several different projects. And so Mr. Diston organized his friends, and he was able to get Mr. Reed, or Sir Edward Reed, and Jacobus Wertheim from Holland, and get all these men together to put $1 million toward this debt that Florida had. And in exchange, the state of Florida granted 4 million acres of land to Mr. Diston and to all these other gentlemen. 4 million acres, a quarter an acre, which at the time was considered, well, let's say Mr. Diston did pretty well. Now, my brother was a partner in this as well, and he made quite a bit of money. And it was decided that the best thing that we could do, since I had these 2 young girls, and Anson, or his adopted son, who I've neglected to mention, Leandro, who was also living with me because my brother adopted him and then promptly sent him to Boston to live with me. Figured that I needed a teenage boy to help my household. So we decided that we should look over these lands. And in 1882, my brother came with Mr. Diston and several other people to look at the land here. And in 1883, I came with the rest of the family in the spring, and we looked at what was here, and we decided this would be a good place to spend our winters. I was not that healthy, and the girls could use a place that was a healthy spot. And Leandro was finishing up high school and starting MIT, so I didn't have to worry about bringing him with me right at that time. And we moved to Tarpon Springs. We came to town, and there were people here already, mind you. There were the Myers, there were the Ormans, the Boyers. They were all here. And in fact, Joshua Boyer's wife, Mary Ormond, is attributed, the name of the town was attributed to her. She saw fish jumping in the bayou, and these weren't mullet. These were tarpon, and she saw Tarpon Spring, hence the name of the town. And so she named it that. But we had so many people who were wanting to come to a more healthful climate, people from up north. And yes, the people were here, but they were kind of scattered around. They were, the Thompsons had their land that was south of town, and the Boyers were east of town, and the Gauzes were down farther south, and just, it wasn't an organized town as such. So around 1883, my brother started recruiting more people, and we talked with other people. And my friend Fidelia Whitcomb, who I mentioned, was not terribly well. She had a medical practice in London, New York, and she had relatives who were also very active in the Universalist church. And she decided that she would talk some of these relatives into coming to Florida at the same time she did. So she came in the spring of 1883, just when I was here, and her brother-in-law, Samuel Pierce Whitcomb, came from Bradford, Pennsylvania. Now, he ran a bookstore in Bradford, Pennsylvania, and he had a lot of friends in Bradford, and he told them about this marvelous place, Tarpon Springs. And so not only did he come with his wife Juliet, but a man named Charles Dix Webster came, C.D. Webster, and a man named Truex, George Truex, who had the newspaper in Bradford, Pennsylvania, and started a newspaper here not too long ago. And several other folks came. Mr. DeGolier came. Now, Mr. DeGolier is our new mayor. He was just named mayor as we incorporated last month, or 6 weeks ago. And so all of these people joined together, and we recruited people from a number of different places. Fidelia's son, Merrick Whitcomb, is our town clerk. And Merrick was a man who was not very old when you think about it. He was just graduated from Harvard in 1880, but he wanted to be in on the ground floor of a town just starting. He thought that this would be a grand place to be. He was quite inventive too. He had a number of other projects that he had in mind. In fact, he actually strung the first telephone line, not telegraph line, but telephone line in 1877 in the town of Nunda, New York. I realized that the telephone was only invented in 1876, and he strung a telephone line. He was still in college at the time, but he was quite remarkable. But he came here, and he's now our town clerk. So things have been progressing very nicely. Well, at the same time that these folks were here, there was the start of the Universalist church. There was a move afoot to get the church started. And in 1885, my friend Fidelia, who had been very active in the church, decided that it was time that something start. We'd had some lectures over the schoolhouse, what was used at the schoolhouse at the time, but it was some Bible study things, but it wasn't as active as the people wanted to be. And so in 1885, and then in 1886, Fidelia and a reverend who had come down here, the Henry de Lafayette Webster, had come here, and he was our minister, and still is until, I guess, a couple of days from now when he's going to be leaving to go back to Chicago, where he has come from. But people got together, and 14 people came together and started the church and decided that we needed to have a church building. And isn't it marvelous that we've been able to get for $1,500 this church building? And we're still paying off the mortgage, mind you. And we will be but not terribly long. We have all kinds of activities here. The church, even though it is called Universalist, it's open to everyone, anyone who wants to come here, whether they be Presbyterians, Methodists, Jewish, no matter what. And we have Jewish people in town. Mr. Bloom and his family. Mr. Bloom runs one of our best mercantile houses in town. He built part of the wharf so that he could have his goods shipped in when the Mary Diston comes in. It was very important that we get all of our various goods from up north. They come by rail, but then at Cedar Key they have to get unloaded, come down on the Governor Safford, the big boat, the steamship, and then they get unloaded at the pier head, and then they come in on the Mary Diston to the dock. Mr. Bloom has arranged for that. Mr. Bloom had a boat built named after his granddaughter, Gracie, and then it sank in Salt Lake. They're still trying to find it. What can we say? His son is a dentist in town. We have so many people who are very active in so many different pursuits. We have Mr. Buchanan, who runs the meat market. We have he also delivers milk door to door. We have Mr. Bremner, who runs the bakery, the German man. We have people from all different parts of the country. As I mentioned, the people from Bradford, Pennsylvania, but we also have people from Nunda, New York, the Thorntons. They have a house just being built on the bayou here. They're very active in the area. And the people from Blue Island, Illinois, who have come down, friends of ours from when we were living in Crete, but Blue Island was not that much farther from Crete, and my brother Alfred, who died in 1877 when we were up in Burlington, Vermont, he's buried in Blue Island, Illinois. But the people from Blue Island, the Masseys and the Rexfords come down here just as winter visitors, but the Masseys are here, and Emily Massey's building a cottage right now on Spring Bayou. And so there are so many people that we know. All our friends are here. It's wonderful. And then, of course, I've neglected to mention the Tarpon Springs Hotel. Why didn't somebody bring that up? Yes. Tarpon Springs Hotel is just that. Mr. Diston wanted to have this be a health spa. That was his initial intent. At least that's what he says. But I think he was listening to my brother, who was listening to me, because this is one of the healthiest spots in the world. I was saying that way before Dr. Van Bibber had said that. Now, Dr. Van Bibber in 1885 made mention of it at the American Medical Association convention in New Orleans. And he said that the Pinellas Peninsula was the most healthful spot in the world. And of course, that the most healthful spot was at the southern end of the peninsula, Point Pinellas. Now, my brother has a house down there, and Mr. Diston has a house down there, but did it occur to anyone that Dr. Van Bibber has land down there that he owns? And I have to say that we are much in a better position to be a health spa, because we have not only the same climate and wonderful breezes coming off of the Gulf and marvelous pines and just the most healthful climate you can imagine, but we also have the mineral springs here, the healthful mineral springs, the health-giving waters that people come specifically to Tarpon Springs to drink. Now, they may not smell that good. Now, you all are aware of that. But they're very good for you. So you go right ahead and drink what you can, because you will do well. I once wrote to a medical journal, and I don't know if it was around April 1st of that year, but I once wrote that a gentleman who had been drinking of the springs, he was an arthritic man, crippled beyond belief, he could barely move. He drank of the spring water, and he was able to move with the agility of youth right after he drank of the spring water. And his gray hair turned brown, and the area where he was lacking hair, and he was somewhat bald, became hirsute and totally brown haired. And I think people believed it. But needless to say, they're good for you. And we have so much in the way of fresh fruit. People grow vegetables in their yards. The Sweetsers have one of the best gardens in town. We have not only vegetable gardens, but we have flower gardens. We have so much to offer. And of course, the different sports that are available. The hotel, which has 50 rooms, also makes available for our guests. And Fidelia and I, by the way, are the managers of the hotel this year. We were last year, and we are this year. We're actually running this place, and we cater to invalids, people who come from up north and who get much healthier because they're out on the bayou rowing their boats. They are fishing. They are having a marvelous time here. They're getting plenty of fresh air, exercise, and good food, which is the best thing you can possibly imagine. there is so much that is out there, people who are eating sugar and white flour and just things that they should not be eating. It's just amazing. But we're getting people to eat properly here. This is our goal, to make people healthy and to bring people and improve their lives, not just with their health, but morally and ethically as well. And here we are now, 1887. We've come this far. We have so much farther to go, of course. We have the townspeople who are running our town. I'll tell you a little bit about them. We have the aldermen who were picked when we incorporated, Mr. Webster, of course, or not Mr. Webster, excuse me, C.D. Webster, Charles Dix Webster, who has come down here, his uncle being the governor of the state of New York. And we have Mr. Bloom, as I've mentioned, and of course Mr. Boyer, who represents the people who were here prior to our coming, and my brother, of course. And we have all of these people who are joining together to create a wonderful place. Now, Merrick Whitcomb has told me that from what he understands, they're about to incorporate the University of Florida and have it established here in Tarpon Springs. There's a little bit of paperwork that has to be done yet, and they also want to start a medical school here. Merrick is very intent on doing that, and he's been writing back to his friends at Harvard that that's what's going to happen here. And once that starts, there's no telling how far Tarpon Springs will go. And with that, I would like to entertain any questions anybody might have about the town. Yes.
You mentioned you married, but you came down here as a single woman. Where came of your husband?
Well, I will tell you, Mr. Blake, Gorham Blake, came from a very distinguished family in Boston, a very distinguished family. The Blakes have been there since the 1600s. And he was a very, I guess I should say, volatile individual. And he was either extremely wealthy or bankrupt at any given time. And when I married him, he wasn't on the extremely wealthy end. But it was all right with me because he was quite an interesting individual. He was scientifically trained. He had a great interest in fossils, and he was out in California. He knew my brother out in California. And we married in 1872, but in 1876, he abandoned me, and he moved to Georgia, Dahlonega, Georgia, where he sought gold mines. There was a gold rush in Dahlonega in the 1820s. And apparently there was a new method of mining, and he was in on this, and he wanted to go down there. And he and I had been of different minds as to how one's home is run anyway, and that was fine with me. And I took my name back in 1879 when I divorced him, and felt that it was much better for me to live as a single woman. Yes?
Did you build the house across the street?
Did I build the house? No, no, my brother did. It was a house that was built, I believe, I'm not really sure because I didn't really officially move into it until the mid-1880s, and he had to add another floor to it. It was only a one-story house to begin with, and it was just being finished up at the end of last year, the end of 1886, to add the second floor. And then I was able to move in with my two daughters. Yes?
Did you attend this church?
Did I attend this church? I am above denominationalism, shall I say? Not above it, but I feel that it's good to follow moral and ethical principles, but my choice is a personal choice. Yes. Yes.
I noticed that they were all men's signatures on the city, whatever you call it.
The incorporation. Yes.
I wish you ladies had gotten together and put a few female signatures on it.
Well, yes, they were all men's signatures on there, and no females, but you have to realize that the females were really running what was going on. We allowed the men to incorporate.
Yes.
And we didn't feel any need to be there.
You were the neck.
Yes, we were the neck, yes.
Where were the mineral springs in Tarpon Springs?
Where were the mineral springs? They are, there are mineral, at the very head of Spring Bayou, there's a little pagoda. And if you go to the very head of the Spring Bayou, you'll see the little pagoda building, and in the little pagoda, there's what looks like a box that has crisscross boards on top of it, and the mineral springs are just beneath there. When you go there, you'll be able to smell your way to it. Yes. Yes. Yes, sir.
The women's organization that you were head of in Boston, what happened to that? Did it grow? Did it become part of the temperance movement?
The Association for the Advancement of Women was not just in Boston, it was for the entire United States. Now, I was also involved with the Moral Education Association. I was president of that in Boston, yes. But I was in the Free Religious Association in Boston. But the organization to which you refer, sir, is the Association for the Advancement of Women. And it was an organization that continued and still does to this day. I'm still a member of it. There are numerous women from all over the country. We have meetings, just sub-meetings, quarterly sub-meetings in different parts of the country, and then annual meetings, generally in October, in different parts of the country. And we speak on women's issues. We generally feature some particular subjects such as finance or dress or whatever topic we choose to be the most important for that particular year. Yes, ma'am.
How long did you run the Tarpon Inn, and can you address the topic of the fire that occurred?
The fire? The Tarpon Springs Hotel was built it started in about 1883. It was still under construction then. And the first year of the people living there was 1880, or staying there as guests, was 1884. And Mr. Scranton ran it that year. And the following year, the Jones family ran it. And then starting the 1885 to 1886 season, in 1886 to the present day, is Fidelia Whitcomb and myself running the place. We have a series of small cottages too, not just the hotel. And my plan eventually is to take these 200 acres that I have purchased and plant small cottages on them and allow women and children and invalids and poor people from various parts of the country to come and spend a week there and I've put aside money, and it's also in my will that there will be money for people to come spend a week in a healthful climate. Now, you, sir, had inquired about temperance, and that I did not finish answering your question. My friend Frances Willard, for whom I worked when I was at the Evanston College for Ladies, has become very involved in temperance, and I have been writing some articles for her about the physiological effects of alcohol and other stimulants, such as tea, coffee. I mean, if you look at a tea tippler, they are as absolutely wretched without their tea, without their stimulant, as an inebriate is without his grog. It's pitiful. Yes, ma'am.
Were you doing surgery when you were here?
Was I doing surgery? Am I doing surgery? Yes, indeed. I am not doing major surgery that requires an operating room as such because we have no hospital, but I am able to do whatever I can to help people for various injuries, accidents that occur. If a little boy cuts his foot, I can sew it up. I have sutures and such to take care of that, and then try to do what I can to prevent infection. And I also am still using homeopathic remedies. I try to incorporate all the best of each type of medicine that is out there. Yes, ma'am.
Is that how you supported yourself being a physician?
Well, I support myself as a physician, yes. I've done that. I've also invested. My brother has given me ideas for investing. I don't like to go into a lot of my personal finances, but yes, I've bought bonds and I've bought property out in Arizona, yes, and using money that I made myself while I was practicing in Boston. Now, one thing that I found very annoying when I was in Boston, and a lady by the name of Harriet Hunt, Dr. Hunt, who was one of the first female physicians in the United States, I interviewed her back in 1872, and her comment to me at that time, taxation without representation, isn't that what happens to women? We make our money, and yet we have no vote. We have no, and there are women out there who say, well, women shouldn't be allowed to vote because we don't know enough about current events. We're not aware of what's going on in the world, but we are aware. We're very aware. And for those who aren't aware, they ought to become aware. And yes, we should be getting the vote, but I don't know how soon that will happen. Yes, ma'am.
Did you ever have contact with Clara Barton?
Oh, Clara Barton's a friend of mine, yes.
All right.
Clara Barton is someone I have known for years. In fact, right before I came back to the United States from Europe, after I was training in Europe, back in 1871, I visited Clara in Geneva. No, actually, she was in Paris then. We were in Paris. And she bade me farewell. I sailed September 26th from England, but I remember I was in Paris several weeks before that, and we had a very nice visit. And we used to correspond when she was in Geneva. We would correspond, and I had hoped to see her in the summer of 1870, but I never made it down to Geneva. I was too busy back in Vienna. Yes?
Did you and Soledad have a good relationship?
Did Soledad and I have a good relationship? Oh, of course, yes. She's my sister-in-law. She's a lovely lady. She is very good for my brother. She's a perfect hostess for him. She's a very nice woman. She's teaching me to speak Spanish. I never actually learned to speak Spanish. After all these years, and you figure I know how to speak French, and of course that makes it French and Italian, so it makes it much easier to learn to speak Spanish, but I'm currently learning to speak Spanish because of her. Yes? Yes?
You mentioned that you wanted to be a surgeon very much, and you were performing surgery.
Well, my medical school training was from 1866 to 1869, and I had very little surgical training in medical school because as a homeopath, one treats illnesses with progressively larger dilutions of various drugs or substances that in very high dosages would be poisonous, but and cause various symptoms, but in very low dosages are helpful to treat. But surgery was not part of homeopathy when I was in medical school. And my training in Europe went from 1869, I arrived in Vienna in the fall of 1869, and I was immediately taken to the rooms where the autopsies were performed and where I started learning surgical technique. And then in 1871, when I went to Breslau, was when I actually started doing surgery myself. But I was seeing surgery all through the time from 1869 until I left in the fall of 1871 to return to the United States. But of course, I had to study very hard because I knew that when I came to the United States, I was not going to have someone to mentor me in the United States. I had to know what I was doing at that time. And I learned how to properly anesthetize, how to try to keep infection as low as possible, and how to do various surgical operations. I even invented a surgical instrument. In 1870, I guess it was probably around 1874, I had a lady patient, most of my patients were ladies, who needed a particular procedure. And it's rather delicate, so I won't go into it, but to do this particular procedure, I needed to have something that was not in existence. And so my husband, who at that time was cooperating with me, helped me invent this, and I actually displayed it at the centennial celebration in the Women's Pavilion in Philadelphia in 1876. And it was very useful. Yes, sir?
What are the plans for the railroad coming to Tarpon Springs?
The question about the railroad, and okay, well that is a very good question. My brother tells me, now it's been approved, it's being built, and a lot of the surveying has been done. That's what C.D. Webster's been doing, what G.E. Noblet's been doing. There are a lot of people who are here surveying for the railroad. And it's coming along, but it's not here yet. It is, he tells me it should be here in September. Somehow I don't think it's going to be done by then. I just don't, but it's on its way. It's called the Orange Belt Railroad. And from what I understand, there's another railroad that's the Silver Springs Railroad that is supposed to be coming to Tarpon Springs as well, but I don't know what the plans are for the future of that, if that's coming anytime soon. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think your adoptive daughters are going to follow in your footsteps?
I would hope, do I think my adoptive daughters would follow in my footsteps? I would hope that they could, although I would hope that their footsteps would be easier than mine, that their path that they would follow would be far more, would have fewer encumbrances upon it. My older daughter, Margarita, has a great brain. She has great potential. She could become a wonderful physician, I think. I've actually, in writing my will, I left her my microscope. Someday when I die, she will inherit my microscope. Gladys is very cute. I've left Gladys some of my jewelry. Gladys is a very sweet little girl when she's not doing something that's not as sweet. I don't know what will become of Gladys.
Are you a wealthy woman?
Am I a wealthy woman? I don't know how one defines wealth.
In terms of dollars.
Well, I don't think that that's an appropriate question, sir. Excuse me, but I think wealth can be judged by what one accepts as being enough, and whether one is a person living in a park, in a tent, as so many of our guests, our winter guests do, living in little white tents around the bayou, and if someone is happy as living in a tent and they're wealthy.
I live for the city of Tarpon Springs.
Well, that is true. I have great plans for doing that, sir, yes. I have, in my will, I have written that there will be money set aside for the building and the maintenance of these cottages that I plan to build on my land here, yes. But exactly how much I wouldn't venture to talk about right now, sir. Yes?
Are you able to own property?
I do. It is possible for a woman to own property here, and I do own property in my own name. Now, it's interesting, when I was in Boston, when I decided that instead of renting various places when I was in medical practice, that I wanted to own my own home, my brother bought the house for me in Boston in 1880. But then something changed up there. I don't know how it worked exactly, but I bought it from him. And so I did own my house in Boston. And I've sold it recently, but because I'm going to be here now.
Did you build about the time that you were in Boston?
I didn't have enough time. When I'm not that familiar with that part of Boston, the Tabernacle of Boston. I did not have enough time to be touring around Boston. I was very busy with my practice, including a lot of my practice was going to the slums of Boston and helping people who needed medical care and running a free clinic. I ran a free clinic up there as well. And I didn't have time to be out and about. Yes? Oh.
Did you know Florence Nightingale?
Did I know Florence Nightingale? No, I did not have the privilege of knowing Florence Nightingale. I knew Clara Barton, but I did not know Florence Nightingale, no.
She was born in 1820.
No. I never had the opportunity to meet Florence Nightingale.
What percentage of your patients were women as opposed to men? Or men as opposed to men?
What percentage of my patients were women as opposed to men? It depends upon where I was practicing at the time. When I was in Boston, almost all of my patients were women because I was a women's doctor. I taught women's medicine, all the things that have to do with medical care for women's diseases. And I did not take care of men up there. But down here, I take care of anyone who needs medical care. Sometimes I will even be called down to Clearwater Harbor to take care of people down there. And whether they're male or female, and it makes no difference to me whether they're men or women, whether they are white or colored, it does not matter. I will take care of anyone if they are in need.
Are you the only doctor in the area?
Well, I'm glad that you brought that up, because there is another female physician, my partner, Dr. Whitcomb, Dr. Fidelia Jane Merrick Whitcomb, who is a homeopathic physician and whom I trained in medical school. She's a little older than I, but she was in medical school after I was. She was there while her son was in school and her daughter was in school, Mrs. Olney, who's here with us now, actually this winter. She's a very fine elocutionist. And Fidelia is trained the same way in terms of homeopathic medicine. She is not a surgeon as I am, but she takes care of patients as well. And in the summertime, she returns to her home in Nunda, New York, where she has a very active medical practice. While she's here, Dr. Ostrander takes care of her practice in Nunda. But she is unfortunately not terribly healthy. And that's the main reason that she came down here. Her husband did not come down here with her because he has to run the family business up there. But she comes down here, and she is a very active physician here as well. Do I have any more questions? No? Well, I think that will be the end of our discussion. If anyone thinks of another question, they ask me afterwards, feel free. And thank you so much for listening. And